parties that could not register their candidates on time have now been thrown a lifeline by the IEC. It announced the reopening of the candidate list process yesterday, following the Constitutional Court's dismissal of the application to postpone the poll. Voter registration will now take place from the 18th of September to the 19th. So what are the implications of this new timetable for both voters and political parties? Joining us now to unpack these issues is independent elections analyst Dawie Scholtz. Dawie, thanks so much for coming onto the program so early. It's really being billed as a victory for the ANC, but do you reckon the argument can be made, that at the same time it's a victory for voters as well? Because in those 93 municipalities where previously the ANC had not registered their candidates, now those voters will have the opportunity to vote for the candidates of their choice.
Yeah, look, I think this is quite a complex issue, and I think it's not over yet, right? So the one thing that's certain is that the DA and potentially other political parties are going to try to go to court to stop this, right? So I think we should just be careful to make it clear that this is actually still an ongoing discussion. I don't think it's fully over yet. The IEC has shown their opinion, but I think some of the other parties may take this to court, right? But if indeed the decision of the IEC stands, which it does for now, it's firstly a huge victory for the ANC. Of course, they were not fully able to register all of their candidates in 93 municipalities across the country, so that's an enormous amount of votes they would have lost. But over and above that, they also didn't register PR lists for both the KZN and Western Cape elections, right, which would have made them ineligible for fully half the seats in those provinces. So it would have been a devastating outcome for them not to have them registered. So it's a huge result for the ANC. And then, of course, look, I think it's a philosophical debate about, the justification of removing a party from the ballot for administrative reasons. Look, it did happen in 2016 to the National Freedom Party. So I think there's an argument that some National Freedom Party voters may say that, well, it happened to us in 2016. Why is the ANC getting a special deal now? But of course, I'm sure there are very, very other countervailing arguments as well about, removing the largest party in the country from the ballot in a large part of the country on administrative reasons. I think it's not on us to have that philosophical debate. I think the courts will now have to make the final decision based on whatever legal process the DA wants to follow. Yeah.
Can you make that comparison between the National Freedom Party and what happened in 2016 and the majority party now in 2021?
Well, procedurally, you certainly can. I guess it's a question of a philosophical question about morally and ethically. But again, as I've said, I don't think you and I are in a position to make the decision. The Constitutional Court gave a judgment on Friday. Different people are interpreting that judgment in different ways, and there will now be a final court process to get an outcome.
So what might that court process look like? As you say, the DA has already indicated that it's going to take this matter to court. So the ConCourt, in its decision on Friday, said that the IEC could make reasonable changes to the electoral program. So, I'm just trying to figure out on what basis would the opposition be taking this on appeal?
So I'm not a lawyer, but the discussions that I've had with lawyers basically the disagreement stems from whether the reasonable changes to the timetable are only related to allowing voters to register, or whether it relates to allowing both voters to register and parties to kind of register new candidates, right? And so there's a disagreement on the interpretation. As I've said, I'm not a lawyer, so I won't venture a very strong opinion on that one. But the court will decide, and it seems quite likely now that the DA will try to interdict the decision by the IEC.
Yeah.
From what I heard from it on Twitter.
Yeah. It's saying a whole range of things, including that the IEC is bending over backwards to accommodate the governing party. Discussions now around the IEC's own credibility can't bode well for the freeness and fairness of these elections, surely.
Yeah, look, we're going to go through a court process, right? So I think the one thing that is very positive about this whole story is that the independence of the judiciary has, I think, is unquestionable throughout this whole process. There's a judgment by the ConCourt. There's the IEC's interpretation thereof. There's the DA and others' interpretation thereof. Those interpretations differ. Let them have a legal discussion. Let's have the independent judiciary make a decision and then proceed from there. Look, I think the IEC is in its good right to interpret it as it will. And honestly, I've spoken to 10 different lawyers about this. I've had 5 lawyers tell me that the ANC isn't in its rights to open or register new candidates, and I've had 5 lawyers tell me that they are. So I do think it's an uncertainty that needs to be clarified, and we're going to go through the legal process now to clarify it.
It just does also, just on the side, raise questions around the Moseneke inquiry. And it was tasked to find out whether we can have free and fair elections during a pandemic. Was that worth the time, effort and money?
Look, I think it was a fair consideration. The fact of the matter is whether the election was going to be in February or whether the election was going to be in November, it was always going to be a complex election. Other countries have pulled it off. I think the fact that we now have a registration weekend before the election is super important development because in my personal opinion, right, I would have said that if voters did not have a chance to register before the election, that would have raised a serious question about the legitimacy of the election for a number of reasons. Firstly, because as we speak now, there's 1.1 million fewer voters on the voters roll than there were in 2019. The reason why that's the case is there's natural attrition in the population, obviously, and people haven't had a chance to register. So young people, there's probably like hundreds of thousands of 18, 19, 20-year-olds who have not had a chance to register yet. And secondly, we also know in these elections you have to vote in your very specific area where you live, right, where you're registered. You can't go vote somewhere else in a local government election. And so people who may be registered technically but have moved since 2019 may be living in an area where they're not registered, right, so they won't be able to vote either. So it's imperative to give those people an opportunity, and luckily the one very good outcome of this is that there will be this registration weekend on the 18th and 19th, so it will be very interesting data we get from that. Because it will be interesting to see the extent to which people are prepared and willing to go out and register, right? I think if they're willing to do so similarly to previous years, it will indicate to us that the kind of people out there are willing to go vote even with the pandemic ongoing. And the other thing which will be very interesting about that weekend is just who goes and register, right? We know from the last couple of elections, particularly the DA has been able to disproportionately register people that vote for it. It'll be interesting to see whether the parties have their operational kind of activities in place to be able to get their supporters out to register and change their registrations. And it's usually quite indicative also of turnout patterns. Who turns out to go register is quite indicative of who turns out to go vote at the end of the day. So it will be very interesting to analyze that data once we have it on the 20th of September.
Dawie Scholtz, thanks so much for weighing in on this issue, an incredibly important one at that. He is an independent elections analyst as we continue to unpack those announcements made by the IEC just yesterday.